This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Ezekiel 47, verses 1 through 12. It's the basis for the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on August 24, 2025. It's part of our series, Water and Spirit, about how we have peace in the midst of an ever-changing world. So let's hear the text from the New American Standard Bible in its 2020 revision as I begin at Ezekiel 47, verse 1. Then he brought me back to the door of the house, and behold, water was flowing from under the threshold of the house toward the east, for the house faced east. And the water was flowing down from under, from the right side of the house, from the south of the altar. And he brought me out by way of the north gate, and led me around on the outside to the outer gate by the way facing east. And behold, water was spurting out from the south side. Now when the man went out toward the east with a line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits, and he led me through the water reaching his ankles. Again he measured 1,000 and led me through the water reaching the knees. Again he measured 1,000 and led me through the water reaching the hips. Again he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not wade across because the water had risen, enough water to swim in, a river that could not be crossed by wading. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? Then he brought me back to the bank of the river. Now when I had returned, behold, on the bank of the river there were very many trees on the one side and on the other. Then he said to me, These waters go out toward the eastern region and go down into the Arabah. Then they go toward the sea, being made to flow into the sea, and the waters of the sea become fresh. And it will come about that every living creature which swarms in every place where the river goes will live, and there will be very many fish. For those waters go there, and the others become fresh, so everything will live where the river goes. And it will come about that fishermen will stand beside it, from En-Gedi to En-Galim, and there will be a place for the spreading of nets. Their fish will be according to their kinds, like the fish of the great sea, very many. But its swamps and its marshes will not become fresh, for they will be left for salt. And by the river on its bank, on one side and on the other, will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, and their fruit will not fail. They will bear fruit every month, because their water flows from the sanctuary, and their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. This is a wonderful and hopeful passage of Scripture from the Jewish Scripture, and I want to talk about it in three different segments. The first, I want us to take a look just at the source of this water that is the running metaphor throughout this passage of Scripture in verses 1 to 2. Then we'll turn to the measuring of that water in verses 3 to 5, and then we'll talk about the meaning of that water in verses 6 to 12. So let's start with verses 1 and 2, the source of the water. And before we really even get into verse 1, let's just acknowledge that we don't often read from the prophet Ezekiel, except when we're reading something else. Oftentimes we might be reading another passage of Scripture that alludes to the book of Ezekiel or references it. So the only time we actually go there is when we're looking that up. And this story is such a great story because Ezekiel is one of the most colorful characters in the entire Bible. He was born in Jerusalem, but was exiled along with most of Judah by Babylon. He is a contemporary with Jeremiah and other prophets as well. And at the center of our passage is this section from chapters 40 to 48. It's a vision that Ezekiel has of a new temple. Well, why do they need a new temple? Well, that's because the Temple of Solomon has been destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, an event that Ezekiel was alive for. So his words about this new temple come to a group of defeated Jewish exiles living in Babylon, having lost their temple in Jerusalem. This is important in the setting of our story because what Ezekiel sees here in this vision is a future temple. And that vision is recorded again in chapters 40 to 48 of the book of Ezekiel. But our focus is only on part of that vision that's in chapter 47. Now, in chapter 47, verse 1, the text tells us that he brought me back to the door of the house. Well, you have to read this chapter, of course, in context. Who is the he here? Well, the he is some kind of angelic messenger. And this angelic messenger is touring Ezekiel around the new temple in a vision. And we reach this part of the story. It says that they approach the door of the new temple itself. And by the door, it simply means its gate that goes into the temple area. Now, the temple faces east. And what that means is that you approach it from the west. So keep in mind that facing means the direction people are pointed in the temple space. So they're facing east. This is very similar to today, in which many churches are built, and in some denominations, they're required to be built facing the east. It's here that Ezekiel sees a flow of water under the threshold of this door or gate that begins moving toward the east. And once closer, he begins to see more. He sees how this water flows along the right side of the house or the temple. So you can imagine if Ezekiel is looking to the east and he's looking at this heavenly temple and there's water that's flowing toward the east and then coming out of the temple to its south, that means it's to his right. So if he's looking at the temple, looking east, that means the water's moving to the right, south of the altar. Now, since the east gate behind the temple was closed, actually as it is today in Jerusalem, the messenger led him out by the north gate. Then they walk around the east side of the temple to the southeast corner, and it's there they see this water that's been flowing through the temple is now flowing out of it. So what it says in Ezekiel 47 verses 1 and 2 is that he sees water spurting out to the south side of the house. Now, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and the entire city of Jerusalem is built on the top of a ridge. And that ridge has quite a few different springs in it, including one that's on the Temple Mount. So it was known that one of these springs was there. So Ezekiel having a vision of a temple with a spring isn't unusual. But what that spring does is going to be rather unique. But before we get there, let's talk about this key passageway. That the vision of God's presence is living. Even as the actual Jerusalem sits barren after the destruction wrought by the Babylonians, there is still life. Now, in this vision that Ezekiel has, we hear earlier that he sees this description of how God's presence will return to some future temple. This return is marked by the flowing water in this particular episode. As a matter of fact, the description of how the presence of God comes into that temple in Ezekiel's vision matches the pathway that this water flows. So it's not enough for God to just be in the temple. It's also here in this vision that there's something coming out of the temple, namely water in this instance. So the meaning is significant, powerful, that God is just not there, but is reaching out of there. God is always on the move, reaching and connecting. To be living as God is to do all of these things. So in this story, just when the Jewish community think all is lost, that their temple's destroyed, their city is gone, they've been exiled to a foreign land, along comes this hopeful vision of life. And I think we need to remember that for ourselves as well. When we have those moments when we think either something has been lost or all has been lost, let's remember that there's this vision of God's presence that we must have in our lives that is alive and working in us and through us. We now want to turn to verses 3 to 5, which is the measure of this water that Ezekiel sees coming out of the temple. This is no ordinary movement of water. And before we explain it too much, let me just say a word about the style in which this particular chapter and most of what chapter 40 to 48 are written in. It's called apocalyptic. That may sound familiar to you because apocalyptic style of writing is common in Scripture, and we see it especially in the book of Revelation. In apocalyptic style, the literary style, the style of writing includes vivid imagery, and that imagery is designed to evoke a meaning. So as we look at these images, we want to understand not just what they say literally, but we want to understand what they mean. And that's not to say just because we don't necessarily interpret apocalyptic literally, that does not diminish its meaning. In some ways, apocalyptic amplifies the meaning even more than if we just simply took it literally in a sort of like kind of a flat-footed sort of way. So let's kind of live into this imagery of what's going on here. So in verse 3, this messenger who has been with Ezekiel takes him now to this flow of water that's coming out of the temple in ostensibly Jerusalem, and it's flowing away from it. So it says that the angelic messenger took Ezekiel into the water, and he measured 1,000 cubits. In other words, went from the place where the water was coming out, and the distance they went to was 1,000 cubits away. Well, what's a cubit? Well, a cubit is the distance of your elbow to the end of your middle finger. Typically in the ancient world, this was regarded as about what we would describe as 18 inches. Well, 1,000 measurements of 18 inches is right around 0.3 miles, about a third of a mile. And so they go down this river about a third of a mile. Now, the direction of this river, it says that the water's coming out of the east and the south of the temple. So this is flowing away from the temple just as exactly as you would expect water to flow away from the city of Jerusalem then and today. The water flows down into the Kidron Valley, and there it joins another valley called the Hinnom Valley, and then it begins making its journey east toward the Dead Sea. Now, Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet up in elevation, and the Dead Sea is 1,412 feet below sea level. So to this point, the water at 1,000 cubits is up to Ezekiel's ankles. Well, the messenger goes down the river another 1,000 cubits, so now we're at 2/3 of a mile, and the water is now up to his knees. And then the messenger goes down another 1,000 cubits, which now takes us to a full mile about. And the water is now up to Ezekiel's hips, and then goes forward another 1,000 cubits, which would be about 1.3 miles. And the water is now up to Ezekiel's chest. And he says he can no longer wade in the water. It's too deep. He has to swim. Now let's back up just a little bit before we get too much into this. Now, what happens in Jerusalem is that there's the Mediterranean Sea, and there's a coastal plain, and that coastal plain is where Tel Aviv is today, and then there begins to happen an elevation gain that goes up to about that 2,500 or 2,600 feet. So when weather comes in off of the Mediterranean Sea and the coastal plain, it hits this little ridge of about 2,600 feet, and it creates what's called orographic lift. In other words, when the air comes into contact with that elevation, it concentrates it and causes it to rain more on the western slope of those hills than it does the eastern slope, similar to what it does out here in the west coast of the United States, that when weather comes in, it typically runs into mountains, and on the front side of the mountains, the leading edge, there's rain, but on the back side, it tends to be more arid and a desert. That's exactly what it's like in Jerusalem. So because of this lift, there's hardly any rain on the eastern watershed of these mountains as it descends down from 2,500 feet to about 1,400 feet below sea level. So it's a total elevation change of about 4,000 feet. So the landscape from Jerusalem is down on the eastern slope of those mountains. And that means it's all desert all the way down. So I know it sounds a little bit like a weather forecast, but it's important in the story. Where this river goes in Ezekiel's vision is where there is no water. There are no springs. If I showed you a picture of it even today, it is a lifeless landscape. It is a desert. Yet there's this river in this vision that flows and grows even as it heads down. Now, the only source of this water is the miraculous water flowing out of the temple, because there would be no other source of water. So what Ezekiel is describing here defies any common sense. It's a river that grows larger in the desert. Now, the Dead Sea, down at the bottom of that valley, east of Jerusalem, gets its water from the Jordan River. There are a couple of small springs along its western edge, but for the most part, the water comes from the Jordan River that flows out of what we call the Sea of Galilee, or Lake Kinneret today. So what that means is it flows in a closed water system from the Sea of Galilee down the Jordan River into the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea goes nowhere, so the water just evaporates once it gets there. So the measuring of this water is important, that it gets deeper and wider and more significant the further it goes, which is completely counterintuitive. You would expect it to just evaporate as it goes. Rivers don't get bigger on the east side of Jerusalem. They don't even exist there. And that opens, believe it or not, a key passageway for us. That God brings abundance beyond explanation. Water is such a powerful image in Scripture. It represents chaos and mystery. We know this from Genesis chapter 1. But yet, as we read Scripture, we learn that only God can control it. And that's exactly what Ezekiel sees in this vision. He sees this abundance of God flowing forth from the temple. And so the water represents something. It represents vitality and life, that God is going to bring life where there is only death. So something's happening here as an expression of God's abundant love. Where we think it can't happen, it does. Even in moments of hostility and persecution, the love of God prevails. This is a promise we need to hold dear. No matter the situation, or if we might say the desert we might be facing, we have to remember in those moments that God is abundant. We turn now to the closing part of this text, verses 6 to 12, which really helps us lean into the meaning of this vision that Ezekiel is having. And so, how is it that there's this water flowing in such an unnatural way? Ezekiel's probably asking the same question, because the messenger asks him in verse 12, "Son of man," that's the messenger's address to Ezekiel, "Son of man, have you seen this?" Seen what? This incredible sight of a river that grows larger as it moves into the desert. So at that moment, Ezekiel is taken from the deep river water to its edge. And when he's taken to its edge, he sees trees and vegetation growing in the middle of a desert. And all of this is along its banks where nothing would normally grow. Again, it's desert. So it's a vision of life in the midst of death. And so beginning in verse 8, the messenger then describes where that water is going. Tells him that this is going to be an expansion on this theme of life-giving that God does. So Ezekiel's told these waters go down to Arabah, which is at the base of the mountains before the Dead Sea. This water ultimately flows into the Dead Sea. So when the text talks about the sea, it's referring to the Dead Sea. Just a few things you should know about the Dead Sea. 25 to 27% of the Dead Sea is mineral content. And out of the total amount of water that's in the Red Sea, 5% of it is just salt. So because of this, nothing lives in the Dead Sea, hence its name. But these waters that Ezekiel sees, it tells us in Ezekiel 47:8, that these waters will make part of the Dead Sea fresh water. Now, beyond this, the sea will even become a habitat for fish and living creatures. The Dead Sea lives. The river is fresh, and so will a portion of the sea become fresh? And then what comes is kind of a crazy statement here. It talks about fishermen who in En-Gedi, which is about midway down the length of the Dead Sea from north to south. It's fairly near Masada today. That there will be fishermen in En-Gedi, and there'll be fishermen in En-Eglim. And En-Eglim is the location of some of the headwaters of the Jordan River. It's probably located today next to or near to Qumran. This is a bizarre image because if even today, I've been to both of these places, there's nothing that lives there. It is barren, desolate desert. There are people living there, but you don't grow anything there. So it's totally a bizarre image that in these two places there would be fishermen hauling in fish. So the life that exists in the deadliest place. And it talks about how the fish that they're going to harvest out of the Dead Sea and out of this river are going to be fish that are just like those in the Great Sea. The Great Sea is the name of the Mediterranean. But the text tells us then that at the south end of the Dead Sea, which is the edge of where water evaporates, it will remain as is. This will be a place where salt will continue to be and the mineral content of the water will continue to be high. This is a place where salt was gathered. It was an essential substance for life. It was critical for the Jewish people to gather and harvest salt from the Dead Sea. But when we get to verse 12, we get to the core of the meaning here of what this image means. Remember, it's not to be taken literally. It's been to say what it means. And in verse 12, we hear that the trees that grow on either side of the bank of the river will bear fruit for food. And this has echoes in it of the Garden of Eden. The leaves, it says, will not wither. And that's the way we hear that there's not going to be any seasons. There's no autumn. There's no cycle of life, death, and life again. So there's no season of dying or dormancy. It's the same with the fruit, that there's always going to be fruit there. So now the meaning of the vision starts to become even clearer, that the source of life and fruit itself, all of these things that are happening are because of water that is flowing from the temple. So the source of life, at least in terms of the meaning of the story, it's not the water, it's that the water comes from God, that God is the sustainer of life, that God can create life even in the midst of death. And that the fruit will sustain people. In other words, God will give life and sustenance. The leaves, it says at the end of verse 12, are for healing, that God will bring healing with an end to suffering, pain, and death. The meaning here is clear. In this new age, God will be with the people and give them life eternal and abundant. And it's for this reason this text is one of the most hopeful ones in the entire body of Jewish scripture, and it opens a final key passageway for us. True life is found in God alone. True life is found in God alone. The vision of Ezekiel tells us of a God with us and a God for us, healing and wholeness. These amazing signs in the vision point to the reality of God with us and God saving us. If this image of a tree with trees and fruit growing on it and the leaves for the healing of the nation sound familiar to you, it's because John tells us of this very same vision in Revelation chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, really lifted from Ezekiel's vision. Here's what Revelation 22, 1 and 2 says. Then he showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, through the middle of the street of the city also. On either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Water in this story is symbolic and represents life, because God is life. We taste it now, and we will drink fully of it in the age to come. Passages has moved to a new podcast host on the FFMC podcast. So I'd encourage you to please subscribe to FFMC, First Free Methodist Church, which is the name of our podcast, using your favorite podcasting app. This separate podcast for passages that you might be subscribed to will be closing down at the end of September. I also encourage you to visit ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.